I didn't wake up to an alarm clock or bird song that morning. I woke up to the sound of tires grinding into my driveway and the sharp slam of a car door like a challenge being thrown at my front steps. HOA Karen was standing there with her arms crossed, chin tilted up, and a smug little smile that said she thought my home was just another prop in her neighborhood theater of control. Her white sedan was parked sideways across my driveway, blocking my garage completely, her Boss Babe sticker peeling in the sun as if even the adhesive was tired of clinging to her delusions. She didn't knock, she didn't call, she just claimed the concrete in front of my house like she believed her clipboard gave her ownership of everything she could see. She raised her voice so the neighbors could hear, announcing that my driveway was now community access space under her freshly minted bylaw, and that she was exercising authority. I watched her talk as if her words were laws, and my property was a stage. Her confidence wasn't strength, it was ignorance dressed in authority's clothing, and she had no idea she had chosen the worst possible person to provoke on the worst possible stretch of ground. I stepped outside, not to shout, but to look directly at the woman who decided that blocking my driveway was her latest way of reminding everyone she believed herself untouchable. She misread my silence as fear, and that mistake was the first step toward the regret that was about to consume her life. She thought I was just another quiet homeowner she could bully. She was wrong. She had set her car, her pride, and her entire paper kingdom across the access point to a federally protected waterway, and she had just declared a war she was completely unequipped to fight. I didn't need to puff my chest or match her volume because my entire life had already prepared me for people exactly like HOA Karen, people who mistake proximity to rules for ownership of power. Long before she ever circled my house with her clipboard, my world was built on precision, law, and consequences that don't care about tone or attitude. This property wasn't some random lot I happened to buy. It was the house my father designed with his own hands in 1962, laid out with slide rule accuracy, and anchored to the land the way a ship is anchored to harbor rock. He showed me the original plat survey himself when I was a boy, unrolling the vellum on the kitchen table like a sacred map, and taking me outside to tap the iron markers he'd driven into the soil with a sledgehammer, every line measured, every boundary recorded, every right-of-way marked, so there would never be confusion about what belonged to our family. I followed that path all the way to West Point, to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, to 30 years of learning the exact meaning of terms like jurisdiction, riparian buffer, conservation easement, and federal supremacy over local posturing. I spent my career determining where land ends and federal responsibility begins, how water decides boundaries, even when people don't like what the law says about it, while HOA Karen was learning how to weaponize bylaws and smile while issuing fines. I was building levee systems along rivers that could swallow cities, drafting emergency regulations in the aftermath of hurricanes, and signing documents where a single wrong line could cost lives or destroy ecosystems. My entire professional life was about water, where it flows, who may touch it, and who absolutely may not. The small creek behind my house isn't a decoration. It is a federally protected waterway feeding into a larger system that places it squarely under laws she had never bothered to even Google, let alone respect. Even after retiring, I kept my license active, my clearance current, my relationships intact. The people who sign off on enforcement actions don't just recognize my name. Many of them have sat across briefing tables from me while we argued about policy that later became law. To my neighbors, I was just Frank, the quiet guy who helped them with drainage problems, foundation cracks, and backyard flooding. To HOA Karen, I was the elderly widower with roses and too much patience. But beneath the quiet, I was still the man who had spent 3 decades writing and enforcing regulations she was about to trample with the subtlety of a marching band. She saw a driveway. I saw jurisdiction. She saw an opportunity to humiliate. I saw a documented obstruction of access across a conservation easement tied directly to federal authority. She thought she was fighting a homeowner. In reality, she had just picked a fight with the exact professional discipline she was violating, wrapped in the one person who had the knowledge, and network to dismantle everything she had built without raising his voice. HOA Karen didn't seize control of the neighborhood overnight. She built it piece by piece the way termites hollow out a house, quietly at first, then openly once she thought no one would stop her. When she first arrived, she wore friendliness like a costume, walking door to door with glossy mailers about protecting property values and beautifying the community, speaking in that syrupy tone that sounds polite until you notice it leaves bruises. She identified the people who wouldn't resist, the ones too tired or too busy to fight, and she stacked the board with them, smiling for photos and pretending it was democracy, while she lined up a rubber stamp committee that would never tell her no. The Architectural Review Committee became her favorite weapon, not because it protected anything, but because it allowed her to point at a rule book and pretend that her personal grudges were law. She pushed through new rules faster than most people could read them, buried in legal language designed to confuse, not clarify, granting herself the power to issue unlimited fines without full board votes. That was the turning point. Overnight, she transformed from a neighbor with a title into a self-appointed monarch who believed that a signature at the bottom of a PDF made her untouchable. She learned to target carefully older residents with fixed incomes, families new to the country, anyone who hesitated when she spoke. Those became her practice runs. A couple down the street was fined thousands for non-compliant mulch. And when panic set in, she appeared at their door with a contractor recommendation and a practiced look of sympathy, never mentioning that the man she recommended was her brother-in-law. A young family installed a brightly colored swing set, and within weeks she had a lien on their home, smiling sweetly as she explained that rules are rules, and children adapt quickly. People stopped planting flowers they loved, stopped painting their doors the colors they wanted, stopped speaking freely at meetings because they knew she wrote down names. She cultivated fear the way some people cultivate gardens, pruning confidence wherever it appeared. Her clipboard wasn't an accessory. It was the scepter she used to tap on mailboxes, point at driveways, and announce judgments she had no moral right to make. The more people complied, the bolder she became, because nothing feeds arrogance like quiet submission. Parking in my driveway wasn't an impulsive act. It was the culmination of a pattern. She had grown used to walking onto other people's property and treating it like a stage for her authority, used to hearing doors open when she knocked and voices tremble when she spoke. She believed she had rewritten the social contract inside the neighborhood, recasting herself as the final word on everything from paint color to personal worth. What she never understood was that control built on intimidation collapses the moment it meets someone who is both unafraid and informed. She didn't just underestimate me, she overestimated herself, and the combination was fatal to the little empire she thought she ruled. I knew that arguing with HOA Karen on her turf was pointless because she thrived on confusion, manipulation, and the sound of her own voice. So instead of raising mine, I went silent and went to work, because facts don't shout. They crush. The first thing I did was strip the situation down to bedrock reality, starting not with her fake bylaws or her dramatic emails, but with my land itself, measuring every inch the way my father taught me, walking the boundaries with a surveyor's calm and a soldier's patience, confirming markers, photographing lines, and building a record she couldn't rewrite with a smug smile. From there, I went back through every recorded document tied to my property, pulling deeds, plats, and historical surveys, not trusting memory or assumption, because real power isn't loud authority. It's paper with signatures and seals that existed decades before HOA Karen was even born. As I read, patterns appeared, and patterns tell stories. The conservation easements, access restrictions, and protected buffers were all there in black ink, legally superior to anything she had pushed through her puppet board, and with each page the false universe she had built around herself lost structural integrity. I didn't stop at my property. I mapped her power the way you map a floodplain, following how far the damage spread. I requested financials, vendor lists, landscaping projects, and contract records, the kinds of things tyrants never expect anyone to actually read, and it was all the same names, the same shell companies, the same money circling back like water in a closed loop, proof not of community service but of personal enrichment disguised as aesthetic improvement. Then I turned outward into the neighborhood, quietly listening, because people who have been hurt don't usually speak until someone proves they will be believed. One by one they came forward, voices trembling at first, telling me about coerced upgrades, sudden fines, liens threatened over meaningless violations, and promised waivers that magically appeared if they used her preferred contractor. Every story matched the others like pieces of the same blueprint, and every one of them I documented, time-stamped, notarized, and preserved. Not gossip, but evidence. Technology did the rest. I took photographs of her car blocking my driveway on different days, filmed her walking onto properties she didn't own, recorded her words when she thought she was simply being firm, and compiled email chains in which her friendliness cracked and the threats showed through. The more I gathered, the calmer I became, because there is a very specific calm that comes when you stop wondering whether you are right and knowing you can prove it. By the time I finished, I had a file thicker than her binder of bogus citations, a quiet arsenal made of dates, maps, photos, testimonies, and the hard gravity of law. What she saw as petty neighborhood dominance had wandered into territory where federal regulations, consumer protection statutes, and fraud laws live, and unlike her HOA newsletter, those don't care about her tone of voice. The beauty of proof is that it removes argument from the equation. She could talk, posture, threaten, smirk, and perform, but the evidence sat there like a weight she couldn't. Discovery wasn't a dramatic movie moment. It was a steady tightening, a closing circle of facts around someone who thought she was untouchable. And somewhere between the first document I pulled and the last photograph I took, I stopped feeling harassed and started feeling something far more dangerous to her than anger. I felt certainty. The day everything broke open didn't arrive with drama at first. It arrived with the stillness that always comes right before a storm. The quiet hour when the bully still believes she's in control and has no idea that the ground beneath her has already been sawed through. HOA Karen marched into the community meeting with her usual theatrical confidence, clipboard tucked like a scepter, plastic smile stretched tight, ready to announce yet another round of fines and threats as if they were civic blessings. But the room felt different, heavier, expectant, as if everyone sensed something was about to give way. I waited until she finished her speech about non-compliant residents jeopardizing property values, a speech so polished from repetition that it sounded like a bad sales script. And then I stood, not to argue, but to move the entire conversation out of her fantasy kingdom and back into the real world where consequences live. I said nothing about feelings, nothing about fairness. I spoke only in dates, parcel numbers, jurisdictional maps, conservation easements, federal correspondence, and documented violations, laying down piece after piece of verifiable truth while her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to the tight, brittle panic of someone realizing the mirror she talks to finally stopped answering back. The board members, who had always nodded along to her demands, suddenly had to look at signatures, seals, subpoenas, and agency letters with letterheads that outranked every page in her binder, and you could watch loyalty drain as they understood that they had not been following a strong leader. They had been following someone marching them straight toward legal disaster. The neighbors began speaking, not in whispers anymore, but in full voices, telling their stories of coercion, retaliation, and weaponized rules, calling things by their real names, and every word stripped away another layer of her carefully cultivated authority, until it became obvious that the only power she had ever possessed was the silence she had frightened out of everyone. When she tried to regain control, demanding order and shouting about bylaws, her voice wavered because order had already slipped beyond her reach. The room no longer belonged to her, and she knew it. The final snap came not from me raising my voice, but from something far quieter. The arrival of people whose jobs do not involve neighborhood gossip or committee titles, people whose presence turns bluster into background noise. Their questions were calm, professional, precise, and every answer she gave closed another door around her, until there was nowhere left to posture. Her confidence collapsed in stages, first in her eyes, then in her shoulders, then in the sudden frantic rustling of papers as if the right page might somehow undo reality, but reality doesn't negotiate. What she had built on intimidation melted under the simplest light of accountability, and the audience she had once controlled sat watching her unravel without sympathy because the spell was broken, and everyone could finally see the smallness behind the noise. I didn't gloat. There was no need. Humiliation doesn't require volume, it requires truth. By the time the meeting ended, her authority was not eroded but erased, her threats empty, her rules exposed as brittle tools for self-gain, and the empire she believed she ruled was nothing more than paper drifting off a table after the fan gets turned on. She walked out without her usual parade of followers, not as a commander, but as someone who had just discovered that power borrowed through fear returns to its owners the moment fear leaves the room. Collapse alone wasn't enough. HOA Karen had spent years extracting money, dignity, and peace from the people who lived here, and simply watching her lose control would have been a mercy she had never shown anyone. So I shifted from defense to precision offense. Not with shouting or theatrics, but with the exact tools she never expected an ordinary homeowner to possess. I gathered everything I had built during discovery and transformed it from a stack of facts into a coordinated campaign, drafting complaints, affidavits, and sworn statements with the same steady patience she once used to draft violation letters. Only mine didn't rely on bluster. They relied on law that outranked every fantasy rule in her binder. I filed simultaneously, because timing matters when you intend to remove excuses. Consumer protection, state real estate licensing authorities, county ethics review, environmental regulators, and the agencies she had arrogantly dismissed as irrelevant were all notified at once, each receiving a complete package, documented, and impossible to ignore. I didn't threaten her in emails, didn't argue in meetings, didn't announce anything on social media. I simply set an administrative machine in motion and let it do what it was designed to do. Very quietly, gears began to turn. Letters arrived that didn't start with friendly reminder, but with "you are hereby required," and instead of late fees, they contained deadlines backed by statutes, penalties measured not in hundreds but in tens of thousands, and language she could not charm her way. Vendors she had used as extensions of her will started getting questions about kickbacks and fraudulent billing, and their loyalty evaporated the second cooperation agreements were mentioned. Her allies discovered that silence no longer protected them because subpoenas don't respect social circles, and the board members who once parroted her every word started hiring lawyers of their own, all suddenly eager to distance themselves from the woman who had convinced them she was untouchable. At the same time, I pursued civil action with the same precision, naming not only the HOA entity, but HOA Karen personally, because power without accountability is what allowed her to thrive. And accountability means standing alone with your name on the page you created. Every damage she had caused was valued, documented, and claimed. Financial harm, destroyed property, emotional distress, fraudulent liens, retaliatory fines, each item a mirror held up to her conduct. What made this retaliation devastating wasn't rage. It was restraint. I didn't embellish, exaggerate, or guess. I simply presented what she had done in the language she had never bothered to learn, the language of statutes, clauses, and precedents that operate far above neighborhood drama. She tried to regain footing with the same tactics she had always used. Emails filled with faux authority, veiled threats, breezy confidence. But now they were preserved as evidence, every sentence she sent forward becoming another step down. You could watch the realization dawn on her slowly, that she was no longer the hunter walking property lines with a clipboard. She was the subject of investigations conducted by people who don't roll their eyes when you say federal jurisdiction. My retaliation wasn't about vengeance. It was about precision, about restoring balance by applying the exact weight of consequence to the exact actions that earned it. And as the certified letters stacked on her porch and the calls from agencies intensified, she finally understood the fatal miscalculation she had made from the beginning. Not that I was stubborn, not that I was difficult, but that I was patient, documented everything, and knew exactly which levers to pull to make the structure she built out of intimidation collapse on top of her with perfect, inescapable quiet. Victory didn't roar. It arrived the way winter arrives on a still lake, silently, completely, without asking permission. And by the time HOA Karen understood it, there was nothing left for her to grab onto. The investigations matured, decisions were rendered, accounts froze, licenses vanished, and the network of favors and fear she had woven around the neighborhood collapsed into dust under the weight of consequences she once believed applied only to other people. The liens she had waved like weapons were voided, the fines she had bragged about evaporated, and the people she had cornered finally stood upright again, their shoulders lighter, not because anyone gave them permission, but because her permission no longer meant anything. She stopped appearing at meetings, then stopped sending emails, then stopped being mentioned at all, the way a storm becomes an old story once the sky clears. The last time I saw her, she didn't approach, didn't posture, didn't even lift her chin. She simply paused when she realized whose driveway she was walking past, eyes dropping not to the ground, but to the reality she had created for herself. And then she moved on without a word. The neighborhood didn't celebrate. There were no banners, no speeches, no grand declarations. Lawns were mowed, mail was collected, kids rode bikes past the creek she once plotted to carve apart, and life, steady, unremarkable, peaceful, returned as if reclaiming territory that had always belonged to it. My driveway was empty, my roses were replanted, and the signs of authority in this place were small and quiet. Property lines respected, voices calm, rules returned to what they were always meant to be, guides, not weapons. There was no dramatic final confrontation, because none was necessary. Power that depends on fear dies the moment fear leaves, and hers had gone without ceremony. In the end, there was just stillness, a street without tension, a house no one threatened, and a woman who once believed she owned this place learning, finally, how completely she never did.